El Nuevo Sol, Televisión.
I was born in LA, grew up in San Diego and Oregon, and moved to Texas because I wanted to cover the border because I have the longest border and it covers the most Mexican border states. So I went out there to get my degree at UT Austin, and then I got a job at a newspaper in McAllen, which is on the Texas-Mexico border. I worked for a senator from McAllen, from that same area on the border, for 5 years, and I was the communications director, and I did policy work to help draft legislation and things like that, and traveled around in the district, covered Corpus Christi all the way down to McAllen. You know, having been a journalist before that, I felt like a bit of a sellout, actually, going to work for a politician, but he was a senator who I thought was doing good things that I could get behind, and I learned a lot about the political process. I'm ashamed to say I was a journalist, but I didn't really understand really how the political process worked. I mean, I had certain ideas about how it worked. And so once I worked in the Senate, I got to go behind those closed doors where they didn't normally allow reporters to go, and to see how the negotiations worked and how bills got passed. And it was quite an eye-opener seeing how the sausage was getting made at the Capitol, and learned a lot from it. I was fortunate that the senator would allow us, the staff, to sit in on meetings and negotiations, and to talk with him about, you know, why he was supporting one bill over another. And so we got a lot of insight into how the deliberation process worked, and so it really helped inform me, I think, when I went back into journalism, how that process works and what's happening behind the scenes. If anything, I think working at the Texas Capitol really opened my eyes even more, so that we really needed a free press and somebody who was vigilant about what was happening there, so that people would be informed about what was going on, because I saw a lot of things I didn't like, you know, a lot of money, the sort of corrupting influence of money was very, very evident. And so I was fortunate because I went to work for the Texas Observer, which is the state's only statewide progressive magazine, and they are not corporate owned. It's a small publication, but they have a long history of doing investigative work and really sort of unfettered political reporting. So they asked me if I would, you know, come on board as an investigative reporter, and I was very happy to be asked. I mean, there was a real terrible scandal at one point called the Texas Youth Commission. It was detention facilities that were holding kids, you know, under the age of 18, juvenile lockups, and they were being abused and raped by the men who were running the detention facilities. And it had been going on for quite some time, and the Texas Rangers had investigated and done a report on it and had found evidence of this abuse, but nothing was ever done about it. So the report was circulating in the Capitol, and, you know, people knew about it, but nothing was getting done. So they were able to do a story about that abuse and what was happening, to sort of open it up, so that the legislature was forced to have hearings and shut down, you know, these facilities. And there was a whole, you know, these men were fired, and it was a whole shakeup for the whole juvenile detention system, which, you know, should have happened years ago. Before that, I mean, the report had been out for quite some time, and nothing had been done. So that was you know, one of those cases where journalism, you realize how important it is, because when it's something like that gets out into the public, it can't be ignored. You know, at that point, the legislature is forced to deal with it. Journalism is vital because it's a way of educating people about what's happening in government, or, you know, policies that are just not working and making people's lives unbearable. I mean, you see how laws get passed when you're there working in the legislature, and sometimes laws get passed for just ridiculous reasons because somebody's friend wanted it passed or some powerful person, it's going to benefit them. And then, there's this ripple effect, though, where that policy will affect lots of people in an adverse way, maybe, but nobody pays attention to that. So with journalism, you're able to bring attention to policies that are hurting people and to things that should be corrected, so that people, and also explaining to them why, something's happening. I think that's important. A lot of the journalism you see now is very brief, with not a lot of context or analysis. So they tell you something happened, but they don't tell you why or how it came about in the first place, this, policy or whatever that was passed. So I think long form, which is narrative, which is what we do, is really important because it doesn't just tell you what happened, but it tells you why, and it tells you, what's going to happen in the future, and it gives you analysis and context and everything else. The cool thing now about digital journalism and things like that is that we're experimenting with ways that people can look at a long form piece, making it more visually interesting, breaking it up, having interactive pieces in there, video and things like that. So that's kind of cool to sort of experiment with long form and see, different ways of displaying it to a reader. Because I work with a lot of people who are in various states of documentation or not documentation, and or have security issues. That's been going on a lot in the last probably 3 or 4 years with the violence in Mexico. So it's on a case-by-case basis with a story where I talk with the subjects of the story about what, whether I can use their name or not, or where we need to do anonymity and changing various things about where they live and things like that. And that's a discussion I have with my editor also, about what can and cannot be used. And I talk a lot with I'm lucky because I get to spend a long time on my stories. Usually I spend, 2 or 3 months or longer. So I have this time to go back and forth with the people that I'm writing about to make sure that they feel comfortable. I spend a lot of time just explaining the magazine. I mean, a lot of people I work with too are Spanish speaking only, and they're not familiar with the magazine at all. And so explaining why I'm doing the story and things like that. So there's a lot of preparation in advance of actually even doing the story. And then I get a lot of people who are very politely will say yes, they will do the story, and then they'll never ever take my call again. It's this very polite habit they have in Mexico of never saying no, but then never ever picking up your phone call again or answering any of your emails. I'm very persistent, and then after a while, it's like, okay, no, they're not going to talk. And I don't blame them, because they really are doing me a favor by talking to me. They really, I'm sure they talk to their family or whatever, and about, what do we have to gain from this, doing this story, or making ourselves vulnerable in this way. Well, I've been following it pretty heavily since 2010, because that's when things started getting really bad in Tamaulipas, where Reynosa and Matamoros are, and we have much of the Texas border is bordering Tamaulipas. And that's an area that I know fairly well because I used to work in Reynosa when I worked for the daily newspaper in McAllen. I would go to Reynosa and cover the mayoral elections, and I was there when Vicente Fox won the presidency in 2000. And so things got bad there in 2010 when the Zetas splintered off from the Gulf Cartel, and the censorship just got really, really bad with reporters there. Some were killed and some were kidnapped and disappeared, and We watched this, like, you know, there'd always been censorship, fairly heavy censorship in Tamaulipas. I'll probably do 4 or 5 long form stories, which will be between like 5,000 and 10,000 words. And then I'll do shorter pieces online, and then I have a blog called Línea also that I do, which unfortunately I haven't been doing enough because I've been wanting to do longer and longer pieces, because that's kind of the direction I'm going in, where I really feel like everything needs a lot more explanation these days. Because we have a huge border in Texas with Mexico. We cover 4 Mexican states and 2 time zones. So the idea was to just keep up on things happening on the border, you know, weekly, on a weekly basis. It would be nice if I could do it day to day, but I just can't keep up with it. And so what I do is I look at all the clips coming from the border on both sides in Spanish and English, and then, you know, try and do like updates on what's happening down there, you know, what the stories are coming from the border. And I try to give it a different angle too, because it's not really like a daily journalism thing. So I try to give it a more of a different kind of angle, I guess, coming from the observer, you know. And then I do a lot on Twitter as well. I have feeds from Mexico, from Reynosa, and different parts of the border where I follow. Because of the censorship in Mexico now, so much news does not come out at all. So it all comes, you get more stuff off of Twitter from people posting videos and things that are happening over there. So most of the journalists that cover the border now just get a lot of their information off of Twitter or from Facebook. You know, just that citizen, we call them citizen journalists, are posting in those communities. What happened then is that people started posting things on Twitter. Twitter started becoming really important, and that happened in Monterrey too. And mostly people used it at first for like gun battles that were happening, so that they would know which roads to avoid, you know, for family members and things. People were texting, and they were doing a lot of Twitter of like situations of risk, they call them, you know, don't go down Boulevard Hidalgo or whatever because there's a gun battle. And it started off that way, and then they started getting really creative and making like Google Maps of different gun battles and different drug dispensaries where, you know, the Gulf Cartel is that those or whatever were selling drugs or stealing oil from Pemex. And so it was really super interesting to see people experimenting with Twitter and with Facebook. And then we started seeing threats being made against citizen journalists. You know, there were some, 2 people were hung in Nuevo Laredo, and another woman who was part of a chat room was killed, and there were threats made against people using social media. And I've followed some citizen reporters for many years now, and there are some reliable ones and less reliable ones, and so it's a lot of work, because you're not sure who that person is behind the Twitter handle who's relaying this information or why they're relaying it. So a lot of journalists, what you have to do is eventually go and confirm the information yourself. You can't really work off the information they send you because you're not sure it's reliable. But I have cultivated sort of like online relationships with people who I think are pretty reliable, and I've had friends who are journalists who've gone and met with them personally and know them now. They're like friends, and so it's really interesting to see that happen. It's pretty cool, you know, in the face of all this censorship, to see people working to get around it. So there's a lot of intimidation against people who have a following, who are giving out information. And then there's a lot of misinformation. I've seen more and more misinformation coming out over Twitter, which really kind of put a damper on things for me, because it's gotten really murky and really difficult now to tell where the information's coming from and why it's coming out the way it is. So I think they haven't like done outright censorship, but they've done a lot of there's like a very intense sort of misinformation, intimidation campaign going on. I try to do stories in different parts of the border every year. So, I'll do stories in Tamaulipas, I'll do stories in Chihuahua. I haven't done anything in Coahuila, and that's something I want to do maybe this year. So I assigned myself these areas and these stories that I want to explore and just to figure out what's going on. So I do a lot of work in advance before I don't just, go down there and plus I don't want to endanger anybody by showing up on their doorstep and asking them questions or putting them on the spot where they might, get intimidated later after I leave or asked questions. In Chihuahua, they've got some great reporters, that you can come from the outside and work with, and it's much harder in Tamaulipas because the intimidation is so total, and it's really hard to be a journalist there and not be on the cartels, not being watched by them all the time. I mean, when I was working in Reynosa, I ran into a reporter that I had worked with before in the past, and he wanted to help me with the story I was working on, and I could have really used his help, but he said he had to get permission from the cartel first before he could help me, because he said that's what all the journalists had to do there. And at that point I thought, oh great, well now they know for sure I'm here, I think they knew already anyway, but so and it was an immigration story, and I thought, well, I'm doing an immigration story, so I'm not doing anything related to the cartels, but it turns out that they control the immigration routes too, and you have to pay them $500 to cross the river, and so it affects their business. So he told them, and they said no, and they said they would kill him if they saw him helping me, and that it was his last warning. And so at that point they knew, we were what we were doing, and so we decided to leave. That's what's so interesting about the border, is that it's a local story, it's a national story, it's an international story, and there's something new to learn there. Every time you go, something happens that you just go, whoa, what just happened there? It's just collision of two cultures, two languages. It's just a fascinating region that always keeps you on your toes, and trying to learn more and understand, I guess, about all the different communities there, and it's just a fascinating place. Well, it really teaches you patience, because nothing ever comes quickly, when you go, especially to the Mexican side, and you're talking with officials or different people. It takes a lot of waiting. They'll say, yes, I'll meet you tomorrow, but then they won't show up, and then they will show up, and then they may really surprise you. Like, I remember one time I was interviewing the mayor in Reynosa, and he's like, let's go, I'm going to get my hair cut. So I ended up interviewing him while he was getting his hair cut in the barber's, in the barber shop, and then ended up, I guess, at some luncheon with him and a bunch of other, like, powerful people from the city. You would go on these odysseys with people where that you didn't expect, I guess. So you find out all kinds of interesting things about people, and they invite you into their house, and usually, you'll have some food with them or something, and or maybe go to a restaurant or even a bar, and so it's just something that you're kind of off the clock, and you're on their time schedule, whatever they're doing. I'm just like spending time with them, and so I really like that. I like just kind of seeing where the next hour takes us and where we might wind up. But like, I never have any idea really. And I think a lot of times before I go down that I have an idea of the story I'm doing, and then I get down there and there's a point where I realize, oh, this is completely different than what I expected. I don't know what's going on here. I spend more time, and then I learn new things, and then I realize, oh wow, it's actually really different from the way I thought it would be. So I'm lucky because I get to spend that kind of time, so I can really I think, understand something more. I mean, I don't pretend that I really fully understand it, but I think I get a better understanding than just, when I was doing daily journalism, you had to file the story every day by 4 or something, and 4 or 5. And these stories always take longer than that. I think here in the U.S. we cover it like a crime story. The drug war and its kingpins shooting other kingpins, but it's not really that. It's more of a social, political, economic story, I think. In one story I did called The Deadliest Place in Mexico, I wrote about this little farming community near Juarez where they had, one of the highest murder rates in the world. When the military came in, that were sent there by Calderon, President Calderon at the time, to push out the Juarez cartel. But what happened, and what the people there were telling me, was that the military was actually helping Sinaloa cartel take over that territory. So the more people I talked to, the story was much more complex. And then the storyline that we're often given here in the U.S. of like the military is always there and the government is firmly in control and they're clearing these territories of this criminal influence, but it's much more complicated than that. And I think the townspeople thought when the military came in that they were going to protect them, but it was actually the opposite. More people started dying and being killed, and so it really ended up being this sort of scorched earth campaign going on in those communities. So close to the United States too, which is amazing. I mean, really, like just across the bridge from Texas, like a 5-minute, 10-minute drive. And you can see the houses just reduced to rubble that have been burned down, and people have been massacred, and it's really like something from a war zone that you would expect to see maybe overseas in Afghanistan or something, but it was right there. That I have been wanting to write a book about this town of Guadalupe, where I had written this long story, almost 10,000 words long, on the massacres that happened there. And I would say now maybe 30% of the townspeople still live there. And I think about 10% of the people were killed that we know of, and then a lot of the rest of the people either moved into other parts of Mexico or came to the U.S. and sought exile. So I have been interviewing those people, meeting with them, and I went to the town. And I'd like to go back again. I was back, I think 3 or 4 months ago, but the killings had gotten bad again, so they told me not to go. And I took their advice. Because I always talk to people from there first about whether to go or not, or when to go, and they advised me that it wasn't a good idea. So I've been, really learning a lot, I think, from that conflict and trying to figure out what's really happening in other parts of Mexico. I think it's different, in different places, but underlying, I think it's this failure of the justice system and there being no rule of law. None of the people who are murdered, they haven't been investigated. There's 98% of the murders are never investigated, so there's just total impunity, and there's no investigation, and there's no justice, and there's a sense among people that government has completely failed them, and in some senses actually attacked them or been the aggressor. So that's a very dangerous place for a country, I think, to get to if that's happening in many other regions. I mean, now you see the self-defense forces in Michoacan that are taking over pretty much the whole state at this point, and there's also self-defense forces in Guerrero. So I know there's been talk of doing that in Tamaulipas as well, but I'm not sure, what will happen there. Because there's been this vacuum of power left. And I think citizens who are neither involved with the cartels or the government, who just want to live their life, are not able to at this point in time because of the extortions and the kidnapping and the level of violence. So people are really frustrated and looking for some sort of way out or some sort of leadership, but there seems to be a real lack of leadership at this point politically in Mexico. So I think really it's a big, huge crisis for Mexico politically, and I'm not sure where it's going to lead to, and I think it's very serious. And I don't think we realize that over here, because there's a very sophisticated, expensive public relations campaign going on the part of Mexico and the U.S. to promote Mexico as this, dynamic, economic miracle tourist destination, and really promoting that image very, very heavily. I mean, they've spent, Mexico's spent millions and millions of dollars on that, and they've been really successful at it. Most people don't realize what's going on in Tamaulipas or Michoacan or these different places where they're having these conflicts. All they see are pictures of Cancun and, these sunny beaches. And there are still, I still go to Mexico, I go to Mexico City and whatever, and, have family there, and, you can still go and live your life, but there's no denying that the conflict, I think, it's deepening and it's widening in the country, and I think it's going to lead to something pretty seismic. I'm just not sure what yet. I don't know what to expect 10 years down the road, but I think it'll be something very different. Anybody who reads a story, if it's well done and informative, then they've just gotten a window into something that they didn't know anything about. So I think just defining a problem is huge, and I learned that working in government, that in working in political communication, how do you define an issue? How do you explain it to people in a way that they can understand? I think what I like to do in my work is to take something sort of complicated and really break it down and make it really accessible to people so that they can really, and human, like I like to put a human face on a more complex political issue, because everything that happens politically has an impact on us, whether we realize it or not, and I like to connect those dots. So I think it's important for, there's a lot of bad journalism out there that misinforms, so we need more informative, good journalism and responsible journalism, and also original journalism, because what's happened, I think, with Twitter and so forth and the online stuff is this sort of echo chamber, where somebody writes opinion piece and then everybody writes their opinion of that person's opinion, so it's just this like echo chamber based on somebody's opinion in New York or something. And there's a lot of fascinating people that are not parts of those circles, that you just have to go and find and talk to and get a sense of their life and what they're experiencing, and then transmit that to other people who probably, never had any idea of what this person is going through, So, so I think there's a lot of room for informative, responsible journalism.
Okay.